Tonight, we won't open dusty chronicles to list the names of kings or count the battles carved into stone. Instead, we'll walk softly along the banks of the Nile, where the air still remembers prayers whispered thousands of years ago. Here, birth was not just a beginning, but a thread tied to the first sunrise, the first flood, the first breath of the gods themselves. Creation myths told of a world that emerged like a child from the waters of chaos, the sun god rising each morning as if the universe itself were being born again. Families saw every birth as part of that same sacred rhythm, a quiet echo of the first dawn. In homes of mud brick and temples of carved stone, goddesses like Tauret, the hippo-shaped guardian with lion's paws and a crocodile's tail, watched over expectant mothers. Amulets rested on doorframes, prayers curled upward like incense, and midwives prepared spaces where life would enter gently, with the smell of herbs, the murmur of water, and the steady beating of drums outside. So lower the lights. Let the desert night settle around you. And if your breathing begins to follow the slow rhythm of the Nile under the stars, that's just history keeping time with you. If quiet journeys like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share the time and place you're listening from, perhaps the next campfire will be waiting for you there. And as the last glow of that imagined fire settles into the dark, we follow the smoke upstream into courtyards where midwives prepared charms of ivory and faience, where chants mixed with the rustle of palm fronds, and where each birth carried the weight of myth as much as breath. Step by step, the night will open its doors to the rituals, remedies, and quiet devotions that shaped how a civilization welcomed life beneath the eyes of its gods. In ancient Egypt, birth began long before a cry, with the slow unfurling of beliefs so old that sand had been borrowing them for millennia. People along the Nile thought of the world as something that had already survived a first delivery. Creation itself was a kind of birth, the primeval mound rising, the waters parting with a yawn, the sun god emerging daily like a baby blinking in the light. To be born was not a novelty, but a polite continuation of what the gods had been quietly doing since the beginning. And the household treated it like a sacred habit, like refilling the water jar before dusk, or folding linen just so, and putting it in the chest where it would remember its shape overnight. Homes prepared for birth the way one prepares for an eclipse, slowly, carefully, with small objects that didn't look important until you needed them. Amulets were placed where eyes could find them, even in the lamplight. The looped knot of Isis, the eye that watches without blinking, the small blue faience. Figurine of Tauret, ample and unashamed, her rounded belly a promise more than a warning. Base guarded the thresholds in the form of squat, cheerful plaques, sticking out his tongue at anything that would try to frighten the laboring mother. You might think of him as the world's oldest comic relief, a bouncer with a drum, there to make sure only good feelings got in. Somewhere near the doorway sat a little bowl of natron, and somewhere else a string of beads that had already known the warmth of skin. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe, or don't. I'll never know. And Baze will keep standing there, doing his tiny, earnest best. The prayers were not shouted. They were closer to recipes than sermons. Add the name of a goddess, stir in a promise, breathe on it twice. A midwife murmured lines that were probably older than her grandmother, about winds that carry and hands that open, about paths clearing as if the womb were a small, polite road on which traffic was encouraged to move along. The house listened. Even the mats and baskets listened. In Egypt, everything had a history of being useful, and everything loved to be included. Archaeologists later found amulets nestled in corners, engraved with figures so familiar that the carver must have done them by memory. The way we doodle a simple heart and forget we re-drawing something with a few thousand years of practice behind it. The desert has a way of keeping such doodles crisp, the lines hardly smudged at all, as if the sand itself agreed that these were the kinds of details worth preserving. In this world, birth was a rite performed at home, not a spectacle to be witnessed by a crowd. Family and neighbors walked more softly for a while. A pot of barley drink warmed without boiling. Oil waited in a small jar, sealed neatly with a ball of clay and a fingerprint that has not moved in 4,000 years. The logic of it all is soothing, almost domestic in its grandeur. The divine, if it was coming, would arrive in the proper room, at the proper time, in the company of women whose hands knew where to be. There is comfort in that predictable reverence, the way there is comfort in plugging your phone into the same charger every night and trusting the sunrise to find it ready. In Egypt, the sunrise always did. Somewhere between gurgling kettles and the rustle of palm fiber mats came the midwives, the swan, arriving with the calm of people who measure their days not by hours, but by the steady count of healthy infants they have carried from one side of breath to the other. They knew the route, and they knew it in sandals. Their kit was not flashy, claws folded to exact thickness, a knife so well wrapped it looked like a thought, and a basket whose lid was more of a habit than a seal. They brought eyes that could read a woman's face better than any papyrus. They brought voices that could flatten panic into a kind of humming. They brought tools for the practical, oils that warmed without startling, a cord spun to a friendly thickness, a lump of something resinous to sweeten the air because labor is long and rooms are small. These midwives moved with a rhythm the Nile would recognize, setting the scene in a sequence so old that it felt fresh every time. The floor space was open like a fan, mats rearranged with the brisk tenderness of people who love efficiency. Doors were clicked closed, not slammed. Water was tested with the back of the wrist, cool water for the face, warm for the belly, and a smaller bowl set aside for whatever symbolic washing would feel right at the moment when symbols become practical again. No one asked for heroics. They asked for breath, for patience, for a good place to hold on. One midwife tied up her hair in the same knot she always used for this kind of work, a knot that probably had a nickname. The quiet humor in the room was not accidental. It's hard to be terrified while someone is competently rolling a stool into place and telling you, with a smile, that the gods have seen worse. The birthing stool was its own kind of furniture, which is to say it was dignified in a very unassuming way. Imagine a small seat with a crescent cut out, 3 legs to distribute the important business of gravity, and a surface worn smooth by repetition rather than polish. Some stools were plain wood that remembered the tree. Some were painted. Some were ceremonial, carved with figures of protective beings who performed their duties without raising their voices. To sit on such a stool was to agree with the wisdom of balance. Knees apart, back supported by friends, elbows draped where elbows wanted to be. There were also birth bricks, simple, square supports that raised the squatting woman to the right height. Their painted scenes, a mixture of art and instruction, like the ancient equivalent of a helpful diagram in a manual you pretend not to read. Aromatics drifted around this humble architecture, a little myrrh because myrrh knows how to linger a touch of frankincense that behaves like a clean window, and maybe fennel or anise familiar. Kitchen friends invited to the most serious dinner party. Remedies were practical with a twist of optimism. Herbs steeped in beer, honey spread in thin lines as if writing a message to the skin. Oils pressed from seeds that had sat in the sun and learned how to be generous. The desert offered its small pharmacopoeia, and the midwives took only what behaved. They had recipes that sounded like nursery rhymes. 3 of this, 1 of that warm, not hot. Leave it until the color becomes the right shade of reassurance. In the corner, a papyrus folded like a letter might rest inside a jar, a page from the wisdom that later scholars would call the Ebers papyrus lines were medicine, and magic share a bench and agree not to elbow each other. A whispered spell could coexist comfortably with a compress that simply did its job. If the words worked, the mother smiled. If the compress worked, she smiled anyway. Either way, the room kept breathing. There were moments, of course, when the room held its breath. Pain arrived in waves that preferred not to be analyzed. The midwives counted not on clocks, but on faces, hands firm and present, like good opinions you don't have to announce. The serious business of risk was not a secret, but it didn't have to be a guest of honor either. Maternal mortality was a possibility known as one knows the river's flood not daily, but real, and spoken of with the respectful grammar of probability. When complications hinted at showing their faces, there were steps to try, positions to change, a cautious tug here, a gentle pause there. The stool could be moved or abandoned. The floor could become a safer geography. The walls, patient as always, could lean closer as if they could hold a woman up by listening. The medical wisdom of the time walked on both legs. One labeled what we might now call physiological sense. The other labeled protective charm. Honey was applied because honey keeps unpleasant little things from having a good time. Oils were rubbed because skin likes it. Breaths were counted because numbers make panic trip over its own feet. At the same time, a midwife might trace a tiny figure of bays on the mother's skin with the tip of a finger dipped in scented water. Not because the drawing contained chemical properties, but because fingers do, and belief is a generous solvent. If a birth went wrong despite these efforts, the house knew how to be quiet without becoming empty. Neighbors came and stood like furniture, solid and unremarkable. The gods were not blamed. They were informed politely as one informs the weather. It is hard to frighten a culture that measures its landmarks in dynasties and stones. And yet, most births ended with a sound that both collapsed and expanded a room. The first cry. It wasn't always a triumphant shout. Sometimes it was the smallest of squeaks, like a reed flute trying out a note to see if anyone objected. The midwives nodded with the satisfaction of professionals, whose checklists were written on the inside of their eyelids. The cord was cut with the neatness of people who had cut many cords before, the knot tied with the same little motion that appears in countless households when someone remembers where the string is kept. A warm cloth waited like a hug that had been practicing. The infant was greeted not with speeches, but with the practical questions of warm breathing and ready for milk. A quietly cheerful yes to those was as ceremonial as the moment required. Rituals stepped in next on soft feet. The first bath might be water from the Nile, a fact the river accepted with dignified amusement. A few drops could be enough. No one was measuring purity by the cup, only by the intention. Protective blessings were murmured as if speaking too loudly would splash them. A little lotion, a little oil. The newborn's hair was told which direction to lie in, which it ignored. Names were discussed with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for choosing a boat. Some names acknowledged the gods, some the grandparents, some the weather on the day of arrival. A pet name arrived anyway, brought by an aunt who had seen the baby's nose and decided it looked like a particular fruit, and so that was that. In the background, you could almost hear a roomful of ancestors nodding. Naming ceremonies did not require trumpets. They required agreement, a dish of something sweet, and the shared understanding that a person had entered the household without knocking. The days after birth were an organized drift. The mother rested because everyone said she should, and everyone had the authority of people who also brought food. Visitors brought practical luxuries, extra linen that smelled faintly of the cupboard, dates that stuck gently to the fingers, a small rattle made of clay beads and a hollow gourd, because sound is a kind of blanket. An older child hovered like a helpful moon, allowed to peer and then told to go outside and play, which is what older siblings have been trained to do since the invention of doors. The house settled into a pattern of new sounds, tiny erratic breaths, the sipped complaint that preludes hunger, the long silence of milk solving problems. If someone lit a small cone of incense in the evening, it was less about sanctifying the event than about making the house feel tidy in the nose. Domestic holiness is like that. Evidence of these quiet routines spilled beyond the house and into stone. Temple walls in later centuries included birth houses, mamisi, scenes where a divine child took his first steps under a canopy of carved stars. While musicians played instruments we could still recognize if our fingers knew how. Down in the tombs, little images told bigger stories. A mother with a baby on her lap, a father who has learned to hold less breakable things, a grandparent with a face like a folded garment, soft and useful. These are not the dramatic reliefs of battles or festivals. They are the unhurried notes of family life that monuments sometimes forget to sing. Archaeologists like to catalog them with professional composure, but you can tell even they enjoy stumbling on a depiction of a toddler expertly toppling a jar, because some accidents do not change in 4,000 years. What lingers is the scale of it all. A civilization that built pyramids still knew that the smallest room in the house is where the future tends to show up. The same hands that hoed fields and carved stone also learned the weight of a brand new neck. The same gods who sailed the sky like lanterns were invited to sit quietly on a shelf and watch a baby sleep. The Nile rose and fell. Bureaucrats tallied grain in chalky columns, and in the cool shade of courtyards, women compared notes about the best way to wrap a squirming body in linen that had opinions. Even the cats participated by pretending not to. Domestic tranquility in ancient Egypt was not a lack of noise. It was a set of reliable noises, repeated until they became the soundtrack of belonging. Birth, as they understood it, was at once ordinary and cosmic. You could locate it on a mat, on a stool, between the hands of a midwife who had shown up on time. You could also locate it in a myth where the horizon gives birth to light every morning and the gods look on, not intervening, simply approving the choreography they set in motion ages ago. Between those scales, household and horizon Egyptians stitched their days. From these small cries, the voices of pharaohs and peasants alike once rose. And if the night is quiet enough, if the lamp burns a little lower and the room begins to thicken with sleep, you might hear the faintest reed flute note the world makes when a new breath joins the old ones, and you might let your own breathing keep it gentle company until the desert, the river, and the house drift together into the soft, ordinary magic of rest. You might not expect a civilization famous for granite and geometry to be so sentimental about linen, but in ancient Egypt, a folded square of cloth could mean the world, especially when a new world was about to arrive in a small wrinkled bundle. Birth there began as an echo of creation, not an interruption to it. The Egyptians imagined that life first rose from dark waters on a gentle mound, the way an island appears when the Nile retreats. And they liked the idea so much they repeated it each morning with the sun and each lifetime with a child. The first detail is comforting. Being born was not a surprise to the cosmos. It was a habit, like the river exhaling in flood season, like lamps catching with a soft pop at dusk. Even the word for breath carried a sense of partnership, human lungs doing what the gods do at scale, quietly, rhythmically, without drama. If the dawn could wake up every day and pretend it hadn't done this 1,000 times already, a household could too. And so a room was cleared, a floor smoothed, a stool brought closer to the circle of women who had seen more openings than any temple door. If you are still awake by the time we reach the herbal drinks, you can subscribe, or you can let sleep do what Egyptian ritual did best, continue as planned. The house gathered small protections the way the desert collects footprints. On a shelf that remembered every jar ever placed on it, the family arranged amulets like polite guests. Taret, the hippo goddess with a crocodile back and lion paws, known to midwives as a kindly bouncer, stood with her hands on her belly, as if reminding the room which direction the child was supposed to go. Base all beard and grin, stuck out his tongue in the universal language of don't even try it. His squat body, carved on the plaques and headdress because nightmares respect good woodwork. Knotted cords held the looped blood-red sign of the Tayet, the knot of Isis warming in the lamplight. A palm fiber mat was swept with the same attention that once cleaned a shrine. These were not decorations. They were co-workers who didn't take up food. Archaeologists later found them pinned in corners with the persistence of useful habits. And if they seem plentiful, that's because Egypt specialized in small, repeated confidence protective redundancy, like saving 2 copies of a file and then naming both final. The prayers did not thunder. They came out like careful recipes, inherited and memorized, a spoon of this goddess, a pinch of that promise, a handful of verbs that always behave. Midwives swan to the scribes who liked tidy words, spoke to the body as if it were the most reasonable neighbor, which it often is when asked politely. They called the womb a door and suggested it open, please, for family. They invited the winds to arrive and carry. They asked the muscles to braid and unbraid with the known rhythm of rope. If someone recited a line about Horus strolling into daylight with a smirk the way newborns sometimes smirk when gas explains the universe to them, no one corrected the theology. Precision mattered in the room, clean water, warm oil, steady hands, but so did the charming elasticity of myth. One more likeness, one more comparison, and the anxious brain, so eager to imagine accidents, had something else to imagine for a while. The space itself joined the staff. Houses were not hospitals, but they were seasoned, like pans that make every stew better. The birthing room could be a private chamber or an area curtained from the courtyard. There was airflow, but not draft. There was light, but not glare. Pots of natron, that sandy mineral the Egyptians used to clean both temples and teeth, waited to dry what needed drying. An oil lamp burned the way oil lamps burn in every century, quietly, as if listening. Around it, the family collected the ordinary things that become extraordinary by proximity to effort linen sheets. Jars of water, a small bowl holding perfume the way a shell holds the sea. If modern life has the comforting buzz of a refrigerator at night, ancient life had the quiet reassurance of baskets and wood and fired clay keeping their promises. Enter the midwives with their unhurried competence, the kind that makes clocks seem nervous. They came with baskets that looked like everyone else's baskets, and inside them a familiarity that felt like medicine before medicine had a degree. They reorganized the room with expert ankle choreography, placing the stool a hand's width this way, the water that way, the supportive friend's stool directly behind, because a midwife knows that support works best when the supporter's knees already know what to do. They smelled of clean sweat and a little myrrh, because even professionals with practical jobs are allowed to smell faintly like festivals. One might set aside a simple amulet to be pressed into a mother's palm at exactly the moment when belief helps the most, which is never quite the same moment twice. Another might clasp a cord with fingers that have cut many cords, and if you think the knot matters less than anything else, tie your shoelaces badly once and see how fast the universe negotiates with you. The famed birthing stool waited like a well-meaning friend, sturdy, slightly curved, sometimes carved with figures who had a front row seat and the good manners to be quiet. 3 legs held it to the floor the way 3 stories hold a myth. The practical, the protective, and the please let this work. The crescent front allowed gravity to do what gravity does, which is help when invited properly. Some women chose to squat without the stool, using birth bricks, painted rectangles that function like step stools for the business of opening. Those bricks sometimes depicted the goddess kneeling to catch the child, which is an excellent way to remind a mother that she is not alone in inventing humanity yet again. If you've ever assembled furniture without reading the instructions and then gone back to read them and found they are mostly pictures, you understand Egyptian obstetric art. Then came the remedies, because a long process appreciates intermissions. The desert could look minimal, but it kept a surprising pantry. There was fenugreek to steep and anise to soothe, cumin whose seeds taste like warmth and patience, and honey that understood micropolitics before microscopes did. Beer showed up as a respectable ingredient in recipes that promised to encourage the womb's cooperation or mother's resolve, mixed with dates and tonics that probably tasted like courage pretending to be dessert. Oil, sesame, castor, moringa were warmed between the hands until the hands felt warm themselves. Sometimes a lump of resin smoldered so that the room smelled like someone had just told the truth. Spells braided through these practicalities, whispered like breath exercises. The Ebers Papyrus, much later to be named by a scholar who borrowed it from a world that had moved on, preserved some of these mixtures and lines neatly stacked like good thoughts. A recipe could prompt both chemistry and comfort. No one minded which one did the work as long as the work got done. Not everything steered smoothly, and the room understood this without panicking. Pain arrived in polite but insistent waves, unbothered by commentaries about thresholds and tolerances. The midwives counted, not the seconds, but the faces, the pinch between the eyes, the tightening around the mouth, the relief that settled like a bird, ready to fly off again. They shifted positions with the mother because architecture helps when redesigned in real time. Lean here, kneel there, hold the pillar, shoulders back against a friend whose arms are stronger than her words. Water rinsed, oil slicked, cloths were changed with the stealth of professionals who make mess disappear without shaming the laws of physics for doing their job. The house kept up. The jars did what jars do. The lamp attended. Somewhere outside, a neighbor pretended not to listen and prayed anyway. Serious risk lived at the edge of the room, acknowledged without being invited to sit. Everyone knew the mathematics were, how shall we say it, ancient. The Nile's fairness didn't extend to labor. Maternal mortality could visit, and infant survival was a hope stacked high on expertise and luck. But the Egyptians met uncertainty with a repertoire rather than a shrug. In some cases, a hekau, a spoken charm, was recited over a knot that was then untied at the right moment, as if the body could take the hint. In others, a midwife might apply firm pressure or rotate the baby with practiced hands, techniques older than textbooks. If the gods were addressed by name, it was with the tone one uses for relatives who are very busy doing cosmic tasks, but who can spare a second to look down and nod. When loss came, the lamentation was measured, not because pain was small, but because Egypt, with all its time, had learned to pour grief into forms that could be carried. Most of the time, though, the room was rewarded with the soft comedy of a brand new noise. The first cry is more of a question than a sound. Am I here? The answer, wrapped in warm linen, rubbed with a fragrant pat, was yes, you are here, and you have 19 ants already. The cord was cut with a neat instrument whose blade had more experience than its owner, knotted with a motion that midwives could have done while bargaining for onions, and the stump was anointed with something good, making unfriendly things leave. Someone held the baby facing east for a moment because if the sun was going to be dramatic every morning, we might as well be polite about it. A droplet of Nile water sometimes touched the tongue, not to baptize in our sense, but to introduce the child to the river that had sponsored this whole project since before accounting existed. Next came the small ceremonies that feel like big ones because everyone in the room leans in a little. The naming didn't always happen immediately, but talk about names happened right away, which is a kind of naming practice, the verbal equivalent of swaddling. Names might honor a god or a grandmother, or a local circumstance, the north wind, the flood, the timing of a festival, the way the baby's hair seemed to point in 3 directions at once. A nickname arrived uninvited, as nicknames do. Protective spells were murmured in a playful scold, the way modern parents threaten to eat toes. A little lotion sat in the crease of a wrist and made that tiny bit of skin smell like a temple corridor at dawn. You would think a household that could produce such attention would stop after one blessing, but Egypt preferred a steady drizzle of good wishes to a single storm. The days that followed had a texture the tomb paintings loved to remember. A mother resting while a sister brings a cup. A father supervising the beans with the proud incompetence of new fathers everywhere. A cat sneaking into the linen chest because cats understand that softness is more than a metaphor. A rattle made of clay beads in a gourd offered its small rainstorm sound. A string of shells gave the baby something to practice focusing on. If the gods were summoned again, it was for the kind of service call that keeps appliances running, no lightning, only maintenance. Visits came with food because an Egypt conversation is thirsty, and bread will never be offended by olive oil. The house smelled faintly of milk and incense in audience. The trio of perfumes that has lulled more people to sleep than any lullaby ever composed. Meanwhile, record keepers and stone carvers, those great friends of the patient historian, left breadcrumbs for us across centuries. On walls of later temples, especially in places like Dendera and Philae, artisans built mummy birth houses where divine maternity appeared in orderly scenes. A goddess on a couch that looks just comfortable enough to be symbolic, musicians with sistrums shaking the air into celebration, priests carrying small figures as carefully as if they were carrying fire. Private tombs also remembered domestic joys with the seriousness monuments usually reserved for battles. A mother sits, a child reaches, a servant brings a jug, and suddenly the future looks like a well-run kitchen. In hieroglyphic captions, names line up like polite guests. The tiny hands and the careful noses carved into limestone suggest that even millennia ago, someone practicing scales in the quiet discovered the familiar chord progression of family. One might ask, with the curiosity that slips comfortably into drowsiness, what the practical wisdom of those midwives amounts to when stripped of the poetry. Honey to prevent infection, oils to ease friction, change of position to help gravity find the right angle. Breath paced by someone whose calm is contagious, clean fabric, clean water, clean hands. And then the rest, which is the oldest collaboration we have, patient and helper, body and encourager, household and community, old words and new life. The Ebers Papyrus offers lists like a meticulous ant, and some of them read like a surprisingly modern checklist. If this, then that. If that, then try this. Others are as confidently mystical as a well-timed joke. In both cases, the tone is the same. Not the shout of certainty, but the murmur of experience. If we are looking for a grand cinematic medical breakthrough, Egypt gives us instead the incremental kindness of many small competences. Micro-stories hide in the corners, the kind the brain collects as it approaches sleep. A clay pot with a thumbprint baked into the handle, perhaps left by the very person who brought it to the room. A birthing brick whose paint is still bright enough to coach the nerves. A bead from a bracelet that probably tapped against a table during a long night. A headdress carved with bez that suggests nightmares were once considered physical enough to be stepped on. In a letter from a laboring mother to a goddess, if such a letter existed and then stubbornly refused to dissolve in the damp, we would probably hear courteous bargaining. I will offer a cake, and another cake, and I want to complain about the price of coming again if you keep an eye on this child's lungs. But the gods didn't need letters. The house had already translated its hope into action. Every so often this quiet story riffles the larger one. Pharaohs needed heirs, and palaces almost certainly tried to upgrade the household toolkit with gold and intention, but birth refused to become a parade. Even royal mothers worked with midwives whose knowledge was portable and quick. Would a queen have nicknames for her infants that never made the inscriptions? Almost certainly. Would a grandmother in a village make the same face at a newborn's yawn as a grandmother in a palace? Absolutely. The continuity is the point. If a culture is going to invest in eternity, it wisely keeps everyday rituals make sense first. The afterlife is, after all, a scaled-up household. The legacies of those small rooms ripple in ways a sleepy mind finds pleasant to trace. Words for protection become names for people. The knot of Isis appears on jewelry copied 1,000 times. Besley faces re-emerge as comic gargoyles and other centuries. Honey remains in our cupboards, doing exactly what it did then. Even the birthing stool, retired from literal duty, becomes a metaphor for support. 3 legs, balanced pressures, a respectful cutout where the important work happens. And the belief that breath ties us to the order of the day never really left. How else could we feel calmer simply by counting to 4 in and 6 out, as if time obeyed our polite request? So the images linger. A lamp in a room where a woman breathes and someone wise sets a stool at a better angle. A hippo goddess who looks formidable and acts maternal. A river outside that won't stop its reliable conversation with fields. A tiny hand uncurling into the future. The drama is ordinary, which is the best kind for sleep. The details hum softly rather than shout linen, oil, beads, water, names. You can almost hear the rattle the gourd makes when the clay beads pretend to be rain. And the way that small sound is enough to rewrite a baby's attention for a second. And somewhere underneath all the objects and all the hands lies the same ancient confidence that life largely continues as it started, with breath arriving on schedule and rooms learning the art of welcome. If you let your eyes fall half closed now, the Nile will keep flowing at its practice pace. The lamp will burn a mouthful of oil more. The amulets will mind their posts like cheerful doorkeepers, and the story will go on without, needing you to finish it the way good household stories often do. You might not expect a civilization that aligned pyramids with the stars to care deeply about the angle of a birthing stool, but of course they did. In ancient Egypt, beginnings were a specialty, and birth was treated like a small, household sunrise, reliable, deliberate, not rushed. Creation, they said, started when a primeval mound rose from watery quiet and a god exhaled order into the air. It is a comforting thought to begin with. The universe once needed a deep breath and a stable surface, and so do mothers. The Nile taught the lesson every year, swelling as if to remind people that timing and patience are a kind of physics. If you're still awake by the time we reach the common tea, feel free to subscribe or simply allow your eyelids to complete their own very ancient ritual of gently closing. When a household suspected that a new person had quietly joined them, the universe was invited in very politely. Lucky days were consulted the way we now consult the weather app. The calendar hummed with feast days for Hathor, who loved music and good decisions, and for Tauret, the hippopotamus-bodied guardian with the predictable personality of a helpful bouncer. Chalk marks might be drawn on a door lintel, not large enough to inform the neighbors, just big enough to inform fate. In cabinets that had learned the shape of every clay jar they ever held, small amulets waited, the red tie-it knot of Isis as practical as a seatbelt, the wedget eye that promised to keep its own eye open, little ivory magic wands carved from hippopotamus tusk, curved like a smile and sized with crocodiles who for once were on your side. If that sounds like overkill, remember that modern countertops often hold 3 kinds of hand soap, not because one works poorly, but because reassurance enjoys variety. Prayer in this context was part recipe, part conversation with the architecture. A midwife, or simply an older woman with a vocabulary of quiet verbs, might speak to the womb as if it were a neighbor's door. Open in goodness, open in peace. The word ka, the life force, was coaxed like a cat, and breath was borrowed from stories. As the breath of Shu supports the sky, so may breath support you. Someone would place a small statue of Bess where it could glare at bad dreams. Base, famously short and famously bold, is a reminder that protection is often more effective when it looks like it has seen everything and is still amused. If a spell called for a knot to be tied and then untied at a significant moment, the cord was linen because Egypt trusted good linen the way modern people trust sturdy Wi-Fi. Pregnancy tests existed of a sort, and they were patient science disguised as magic. A woman's urine was poured on 2 piles of grain emmer and barley. If the barley sprouted first, some texts cheerfully predicted a boy. If the emmer, a girl. If nothing sprouted at all, perhaps there was no pregnancy, or perhaps the household needed better grain. It was not perfect, but it had the charm of a slow experiment, which may be why it is oddly soothing to picture a pot of damp seeds on a sunny sill, while the house goes about its regular business. Meanwhile, ordinary life adjusted itself around the expectation. A chair in the corner became a favorite. A jar of honey was reserved. A shawl was put aside because its weave somehow took a blessing better than the others. When labor began, it rarely announced itself with drama. The first pains were like notes from a neighbor's study, explanatory, not accusatory. The room adapted. Egyptian houses were made of mud brick and good intentions, and a small chamber could be curtained off with linen, to make a space that felt private in the same way a book feels private when you open it. Bowls of water were set within reach. Natron, the mineral that cleaned both temples and teeth, waited in a shallow dish. Someone lit a lamp, and the wick made that agreeable crackle that says fire's doing the one job it has. In came the midwives, swan in the politely compact language of scribes, though a papyrus is not required to identify competence. They arrived with baskets and with hands that always seemed exactly warm enough. Midwives were apprentices of experience rather than of paperwork. Their training was stored in muscles and the way they distributed their attention, which was evenly like someone sprinkling seeds. They could predict when a woman would prefer pressure on the low back before the woman herself quite knew it. They made a small theater of support behind the stool. One helper sat so the laboring woman could lean back when leaning forward was no longer interesting. Another counted the length of a contraction without looking at the water clock, because the face is a more accurate instrument. These were practical women who nonetheless enjoyed courteous myth. They might hum a line about how there's 7 forms attending the birth, and then, without missing a beat, reorganize the furniture by exactly the thickness of a clay brick. The famous birthing stool looked modest, a simple seat with a crescent cutout, 3 legs that believed in geometry, sometimes painted with guardians who had learned the art of watching without intruding. Its shape made gravity an employee instead of a critic. Some families used birth bricks instead, painted blocks that provided height for squatting, and the bricks sometimes carried little scenes of divine midwifery, as if to say, we have an intern from the heavens. Everything will be fine. Linen pads were prepared like small clouds. Jars of warm water were kept warm in the ordinary way, by being near people who were warm. Remedies were practical and fragrant, 2 qualities that make almost any experience 20% easier. Honey, the diplomat of substances, went into mixtures to discourage infection, and oil castor, sesame. Moringa made the business of muscles and skin more cooperative. Cumin and anise were steeped to calm unease. Fenugreek whispered encouragement to milk glands that were considering their new job description. Date beer, that humble colleague of festivals, appeared in tonics that lived somewhere between placebo and pastry. Malachite, ground into the same green paste that drew elegant lines around eyes, has a dash of copper in it. The ancients did not write about ions, but they noticed that certain painted lids got fewer infections than others, and they happily connected dots. If you prefer the spell versions of all this, those existed too, because words can carry the mind even when the hands are busy. A charm might invite the womb to slide down like the Nile in flood, which is a helpful and very Egyptian image. Music appreciated being present. The sistrum, a rattle with metal tongues that shiver into sound, was both instrument and prayer, and its making of small waves in the air was thought to unsettle unfriendly spirits and simultaneously settle everyone else. Clapping had a rhythm older than paperwork. Someone sang a nonsense song whose main job was to lengthen the exhale. If you have ever breathed out to the length of a slowly poured cup of tea, you already understand the technique. Yet birth could wander into difficulty, and the room was ready to treat misadventure with a thorough kindness. If a baby presented the wrong way, the midwives worked with measured patience and what modern textbooks would call positional techniques, though Egypt had the better vocabulary of analogies. Turn like the falcon turns, come like the lotus opens. Pressure here, lift there. If exhaustion arrived before the child, there were concoctions to coax energy-sweet things, lightly spiced, the original sports drink. The Ebers and Kehun papyri offered instructions that range from sensibly anatomical to cheerfully optimistic, prescribing massages, fumigations with aromatic resins, and the occasional strategic sternness to ward a stubborn cervix. Loss existed at the edge of the light, and when it came, grief moved and prescribed. Careful shapes, laments, pauses, gestures that told the body it had been witnessed and could stop bracing. But most hours belonged to persistence, and persistence did not make speeches. It rearranged the pillows. What modern people might call postpartum care began before anyone had coined post. The cord was cut with a clean blade that had more practice than drama, and the stump was dressed with a mixture that often included honey and natron, a combination that the microbes found unwelcoming. The baby was rubbed with oil so new skin could understand softness. A tiny scrap of cloth became a hat because heads lose heat, and also because there is comedy in how small hats are. Swaddling arranged the brand new limbs into a package that was surprising to no one except the owner. The first cry landed like a stamp on a document received. Someone briefly turned the baby toward the east, a comfortable habit when you live in a country where the sun arrives on schedule. Names were important, but not necessarily urgent. People collected them the way rivers collect silt, by gentle accumulation. A child might acquire a nickname on day one and an official name at a festival. If you named a baby after a god, you were not burdening anyone with divinity. You were borrowing good company. A little Isis, a little Thoth, a little Ramses in miniature Egypt liked its portfolios balanced. Gifts to the goddess might be a cake or 2 cakes, depending on how generous the household felt and how well the oven was behaving. The 7 Hathors, a group chat of fate-deciding ladies, were politely informed that this child required favorable opinions, the way modern parents write an email to a school and CC 3 administrators. The house settled into the ordinary glamour of early days, laundry elevated to sacrament, naps negotiated like treaties, visitors bringing bread because bread is an answer to many questions. Wet nurses were part of the ecosystem. Sometimes a mother nursed her own child, sometimes another woman did. And in either case, the arrangement was recorded in memories and occasionally on papyrus, with the same seriousness one gives to property boundaries. If milk hid for a while, fenugreek and dates gave it hints. Donkey milk made brief appearances for complicated reasons, and everyone politely pretended not to notice the taste. The mother's chair had a better cushion now. Postpartum seclusion existed in some families, not as a punishment, but as a mutual agreement that for a few days the world could come to the threshold and stop there. Outdoors, the Nile continued its internship as calendar and refrigerator. Water fetched for bathing was left to settle so sand could make its unhurried descent. Then a cloth strainer prevented the past from participating in the present. Coal lined small eyes not to impress a fashion critic, but to persuade the sun to be less forward and perhaps to keep flies from conducting investigative journalism. The famous sidewalk of youth, the shaved head with one jaunty braid, arrived later, but its preview could be imagined in the first soft hair that did whatever it pleased. Toys were gentle, faience beads that clicked like distant rain, clay animals whose legs believed in gravity, little rattles that suggested weather. Evidence of all this is scattered across time the way useful objects scatter across a tabletop. Tomb paintings love to show families at peace, a mother seated with dignity, a father pretending not to be smitten, a child reaching for a goose with an optimism that implies no one has yet explained geese. In later periods, temple precincts built mimisi, birthhouse houses, where the divine child Horus is shown welcomed by a staff that includes musicians whose job title, if translated, would be make the air happy. In the private sphere, names and relationships appear in lists as tidy as a shopping receipt. So and so begat so and so, who owns a cat. The continuity is what comforts. The list does not require your complete attention. It just wants you to know it is there. Some patterns look so practical, they feel modern. Midwives washed their hands because clean hands make fewer apologies. Sun-dried linen acted like an extra staff member. The room was kept warm because tiny lungs prefer warm stories. Rituals and remedies formed a braid. If you asked an Egyptian whether the honey helped because of words spoken over it or because honey is honey, a sensible answer would be both, and also, the question is not urgent while we have work to do. That combined confidence, the material and the mystical holding hands, may be why these scenes feel especially sleepy. Nothing is being argued. Everything is being arranged. There are microcuriosities that the brain can wander through as if through a quiet market. The ivory magic wands sometimes show a long-legged creature with a curving snout that scholars call a Seth animal, which may be the earliest instance of someone protecting a baby with a drawing of something no one can identify. Some protective knives were flint, as if the very old stone had seniority in the household. A few birth-related amulets show a mother sitting on a chair that is clearly more comfortable than the average throne, suggesting that at least one artisan had his priorities straight. A rare feeding bottle with a spout looks like it was designed by a potter who had just watched a baby refuse a perfectly good cup and thought, with humility, all right then. The legal and economic world ambled along beside the cradle. In some places, contracts recorded the hiring of a wet nurse for a set number of months, with clothing allowances and grain rations spelled out as calmly as if the document were discussing baskets. Property could be bequeathed to daughters and sons, and names in a will evidence a family's quiet math of care. It is oddly relaxing to imagine a scribe pausing to sand the ink on a line that says, in essence, this baby will one day be a person who can inherit a goat. Time in Egypt was always thinking ahead without making a fuss about it. If a child fell ill, the household escalated its repertoire the way one adds cushions to a chair until it is somehow right. Incense fumigations, honey mixtures, prayers to beasts that bordered on scolding, and visits to a Sonyu who knew which herbs were gentle and which were ambitious. The goal was not heroics. The goal was steadiness. And if night stretched long, someone brought the sistrum again, because the small sound helps the mind count something other than seconds. You can measure the kindness of a culture by how it handles the hours after midnight, and by that measure, Egypt scores well. Eventually, the household re-entered public rhythms. Festivals welcomed families the way markets welcome baskets. At the festival of drunkenness for Hathor, which was less chaotic than it sounds, and more like a permission slip for joy mothers and grandmothers, tied green twigs to their hair and smiled in a way that may have been partly about the goddess, and partly about a baby finally napping. Work resumed in a pattern that included the newest assistant. A sling made from an old linen sheet allowed a mother to grind grain with both hands while keeping an eye and an ear and most of her heart on the small sleeper. The future assembled itself from such practical inventions. In the end, or rather, in the continued middle, the story of Egyptian birth is short on twists and rich in texture. It is the texture that makes it soporific in the best way, natron crunching faintly in a bowl, oil warming in a palm, linen sighing when folded, the river talking to itself just beyond the wall. The gods hover like well-meaning relatives who bring fruit and never overstay. The midwives depart with baskets that are somehow lighter than when they arrived. The lamp is pinched out between damp fingers. In a quiet corner, Bass still shows his tongue at anything that would disturb sleep, which is a solid policy for a household and a perfectly acceptable policy for you too. If your thoughts wish to lie down now, the Nile will keep time, the amulets will maintain their tiny watch, and tomorrow, as usual, will remember how to begin. It is surprising how often a hippopotamus is invited to a quiet human birth, never the actual animal, of course, but its kindly spirit, carved into amulets and perched on shelves, looking both fierce and reassuring at the same time. In ancient Egypt, the beginning of life was not an emergency. It was a rehearsal of creation itself, performed with small props and a patient cast who knew their lines. A family treated pregnancy the way the Nile treated its banks, by rising slowly, leaving gifts of silt, and then settling down as if nothing unusual had happened. If you re still awake by the time I've finished describing the correct temperature of sesame oil, you may subscribe, or you may simply follow the hippo's example and float peacefully in place. The big thoughts arrived first. People said the world began when the first mound rose from none, the primeval waters, and a god took a breath so careful it still echoes. Birth, they felt, was a local copy of that cosmic scene, performed in a courtyard where laundry fluttered, or in a small room arranged as tenderly as one arranges a shelf of bowls, so none of them argue. The household calendar offered opinions about lucky days. The Book of the Heavenly Cow did not come to the door with a clipboard, but neighbors did, bearing observations about the moon, the flood, and the way a cat behaved when stepping over the threshold. Some families chalked tiny symbols above the door, not large enough to inform the street, just large enough to inform chance. Protection grew from objects that liked to be held. There were the little magic wands, curved slivers of hippo tusk graven with crocodiles, lions, and that familiar pot-bellied dwarf with an excellent scowl. The dwarf is Bess equal parts dance instructor and bodyguard, whose skill set included scaring. Nightmares and applauding new parents. Bays never stood straight. He leaned. He stuck out his tongue. You cannot take fright too seriously while he is in the room. Nearby you often found a tight knot of Isis, an amulet shaped like a belt that promised not to slip. The widget eye of Horus watched from a shelf, doing the one thing eyes do best. People wore these things until the cords remembered the shape of their shoulders. Pregnancy tests existed, although they did not yet involve pharmacies or tiny windows that deliver cryptic news. Instead, a woman poured her urine over piles of emmer and barley. If the barley sprouted first, the house predicted a boy. If the emmer, a girl. If nothing sprouted at all, perhaps there was no child yet, or perhaps the grain was having an off week. It sounds quaint until you remember that we still plant seeds to find out what will happen next. The test took days, which meant the family had time to water the pots, talk to them a little, and adjust their routines to include a person who had not arrived. Meanwhile, textiles were counted. Egypt loved good linen the way modern people love good chargers, and the smoothest bandages were put aside for the day when smoothness would matter. When the first cramps announced themselves like unhurried messengers, the room turned practical. A space was screened with linen that smelled faintly of sunshine. Lamps were set on clay saucers. Their flames had nothing to prove. Bowls of water sat to one side, letting the invisible silt of the day drift down. There was a small table for a jar of natron, that all-purpose mineral the Egyptians trusted for cleaning and for telling a room that today it would be excellent. Midwives arrived, not with uniforms, but with hands that had learned which touch was conversation and which was punctuation. They were called Swanwen in one set of texts and by nicknames at home. Documentation was not their way of being excellent. Steadiness was. These women were pragmatic and untheatrical, and they liked gravity. The birthing stool, their famous collaborator, was basically a three-legged chair with a crescent opening that earned its keep. Some households used birth bricks instead painted blocks that raised the mother into a squat. The bricks often carried little pictures of friendly beings who looked as if they had been assigned to stand guard by someone's grandmother. Underneath, linen pads waited like patient clouds. Everything in the room had a job. One helper rubbed the lower back with warm oil. Another kept track of time using the oldest instrument known, the face. Herbal smells unfolded in layers. Honey waited in a shallow bowl, its surface catching the lamplight, ready to sweeten drinks or soothe a sore place. Ground cumin and anise simmered in water, their scents walking around like quiet assistants. Date beer, diluted, stood by to compete mildly with fatigue. Castor oil glinted in a little jar that had once held perfume. It was pressed into service for massage with an apology and a smile. The sistrum rattle of Hathor shivered the air, while palms clapped a rhythm designed to lengthen each exhale so the body could follow the music the way boats follow a current. If anyone recited spell words, they were polite instructions to muscles. Open in goodness, open in health, which is exactly as bossy as a spell should be. Practical care blurred gently into myth. Tauret, the hippo goddess, waddled into conversation as surely as gravity helped the child descend. A small figurine of her stood near the stool, and the midwife would brush it with her fingers, as if checking that the helper had shown up for her shift. Some spells called for tying a string with a knot that would later be untied at the right moment, which is just a formal way of saying timing matters. Other charms told the womb to come down, like the Nile and flood, a simile only people who lived beside a patient river would have thought up. Micro hooks for the mind even then kept attention soft and steady. The lamp-est door latch clicked when the wick was trimmed. The sound of a clay jar settling on a reed mat, the water's tiny swirl after a cup dipped in. Difficult labors happened, although the sources rarely narrate them with the drama modern books prefer. The midwives reposition the mother. They asked the child to turn. They pressed here, lifted there. We would call it a repertoire. They would call it Tuesday. The Ebers Papyrus lists remedies that range from entirely sensible to experimentally optimistic, massage with aromatic oils, fumigations with frankincense, an amulet incised with a crocodile that, frankly, seems to have taken its job seriously. When exhaustion went first to the mother and then to the room itself, sweet drinks arrived, the original sports nutrition, made of dates or figs or beer diluted until it had the personality of flavored water. There were sanitary habits that would look familiar to a nurse. Hands were washed because clean hands trouble fewer gods and fewer germs. Linen was changed as though each layer of cloth knew a secret about comfort. Wounds were dressed with honey and natron, which microbes dislike for reasons they keep to themselves. Malachite paste, the same mineral used to draw protective lines around eyes, contributed a trace of copper to keep lids clean, a small benefit tucked into elegance. Kohl-shadowed lashes not for glamour, but to encourage the sun to mind its manners and the flies to take the day off. And through it all, the midwives watched the mother as if watching were a form of medicine, which it often is. When the baby finally appeared, the room allowed itself a collective exhale that moved like a breeze lifting the edge of a curtain. A blade made for the purpose nipped the cord sharp, quick, practiced. The stump was dabbed with honey and wrapped in linen narrow as ribbon. A little oil smoothed brand new skin into acquaintance with the world. The child was swaddled so the startle reflex met its match in tidy fabric geometry. Someone whispered a catalog of small compliments to test the equipment of luck. Strong fingers, good voice, serious forehead. A tiny hat may have been introduced because even Egypt discovered the comedy of very small hats. Then came the entirely reasonable paperwork of belonging. Names were discussed with the same diplomacy used to place furniture. A household often had more than one name in mind. There might be a day name for shouting across courtyards, a hidden name for closeness, and a theophoric name that invited a god to join the family council, married Amun, beloved of Amun, or Thudi in the care of Thoth, the seven Hathors. A panel of expert fates were invoked so they would say nice things during their meeting whenever it occurred. Gifts were promised: bread, beer, a small cow-shaped cake if the oven cooperated. Timing was forgiving. You could negotiate with destiny, provided you took minutes and brought refreshments. Postpartum life unfolded with the gentleness of a routine that had rehearsed itself for centuries. A lying-in period kept the mother inside, not as punishment, but as a socially supported excuse to nap without commentary. Wet nurses were hired when needed. Contracts survive in later eras, listing rations of grain and clothing allowances as calmly as if they were discussing baskets. If milk hesitated, fenugreek tea had a reputation for persuasion. Donkey milk was the last resort and came with opinions from everyone in the alley. The father contributed by fetching water, surrendering the good cushion, and learning the delicate art of looking helpful without moving anything the midwives had just placed exactly so. Protection continued with gestures so frequent they became invisible. Amulets hung near the cradle. Wooden wands scraped along doorframes to draw an imaginary line that only spirits obeyed. Incense coiled upward in thin gray sentences. Lullabies repeated 2 or 3 notes forever, which is how the brain likes to be convinced. Elders told stories about bats chasing scorpions across courtyards, which may be the earliest example of security footage described verbally. Neighbors offered advice that had the shape of gossip but the content of kindness. Bread appeared in embarrassingly generous quantities. Medicine did not retire after birth. If the baby coughed, someone burned juniper and let the smoke curl through the blanket like a polite visitor. If colic rehearsed its tiny opera, fennel seeds were mashed and steeped in a cup whose handle had been glued twice already and seemed proud of its scars. The mother's body received the slow attention of warm oil, gentle pressure, and the sort of posture advice that modern physical therapists deliver with diagrams. The point was steadiness, not spectacle. Even the language avoided catastrophes. People said the belly is tired and the milk prefers quiet, which solved more than it avoided. Soon, the house re-entered the public calendar, carrying the child like new punctuation. On festival days, the family visited a temple where music rehearsed the old story of the goddess who protects mothers and of a falcon child who grows into his beak. In later centuries, birth houses, mamisi, within temple precincts illustrated the divine version of the everyday scene, complete with midwives and musicians. It is difficult to imagine a louder endorsement of the ordinary. If the gods hold your task in their murals, your task is safely permanent. Evidence of these habits surfaces in little ways that archaeologists love. Tomb scenes show women seated calmly while a toddler reaches for a goose with confidence not yet complicated by experience. Ostraka potsherds used as scratch paper record purchases of oil and cumin with the same tone modern receipts adopt when listing batteries and apples. Wooden toys turn up beside miniature chairs that are clearly more comfortable than at least one royal throne. A rare feeding bottle with a spout looks profoundly practical, as if a potter had been watching a baby ignore a perfectly good cup and had pivoted toward innovation with a sigh. Law and memory joined hands whenever possible. Adoption contracts and wills included children with the efficiency of people who understood that tomorrow keeps good records. Daughters appear as heirs often enough to make our eyebrows rise at the modern world, and sons need bread and paintings with a seriousness that suggests perfection is measured in crumbs. Names travel down columns like little boats in a canal. So-and-so, son of so-and-so, who is good at weaving. Daughter of so-and-so, who owned a cat and therefore understood responsibility. It is all so pleasantly specific. If you step back from the artifacts and the practicalities, what remains is a pattern of courteous attention. Birth in ancient Egypt has the rhythm of people arranging a room so that the main event can be mostly quiet. There is sound, yes, clapping, a sistrum, the small snorts of a lamp catching its breath, but even the noises seem hired to make a hush. The gods in attendance are household gods, small enough to stand on a shelf, large enough to suggest the universe cares about doorways and blankets. The midwives are not mystical. They are competent, which is better. The mother breathes, someone counts, and somewhere a pot of seeds is hopefully sprouting on a windowsill. If you are searching for the spectacular, you will not find it here. You will find warm oil that must not be too warm, a stool set at a sensible angle, linen folded just so, a pot of cumin tea that has to be sipped before it becomes bossy, a cat choosing the corner with the best sun, and a little statue of a hippopotamus who, despite her expression, clearly appreciates sleepy afternoons. New life arrives without trumpets and is wrapped and named eventually and given an amulet that looks like a knot tied by someone careful. The lamp is pinched out. The room remembers darkness. The Nile keeps thinking about the moon. You can keep listening if you like, or you can do what the gods do after a well-managed ceremony, which is to sit quietly and be pleased and not say much at all. You might not expect the price of wheat to determine the size of your breakfast, but for a few hundred quiet years in medieval towns, that is exactly how mornings worked. Before the sun warmed the roof tiles, the bakers were already negotiating with numbers, nudging dough with the same diplomacy one uses to seat grumpy relatives at a wedding. The rule was called be a size of bread and ale, which sounds grand, yet behaved like a kitchen scale with a legal education. If the grain got expensive, the law did not raise the price of a loaf. It shrank the loaf instead, with a decisiveness only bureaucracy can achieve. If you're still awake when we start weighing loaves with pebbles, feel free to subscribe, or simply let the thought drift off like steam from a cooling crust. The day began in grain and in guesswork. Millers turned wheat into flour with stones that hummed like distant bees. The bag came home dusted with gossip and chaff, and there it met the bolting cloth, a fine sieve that separated pride from practicality. What fell through became white flour. What stayed behind went into something darker and arguably more honest. Water joined in at a temperature the wrist could approve of. Salt followed, trying to be invisible and failing, as salt always does. Yeast was not yet a neat packet with instructions. It was Barma frothy scoop, rescued from yesterday's ale, carefully, coaxed from a pot where it lived like a pet with ambitions. The dough learned your hands, and you learned its language, which consisted mostly of saying, wait, and now. Appeal, the long wooden paddle leaned against the oven. Patient as a grandfather with a good chair, the oven was a dome of clay or brick that took its time. It was heated first with a fire and then with memories. After the flames were raked out, the heat sat politely, ready to work. Bakers tested the temperature the way cooks still do, with rituals that are not entirely scientific and therefore incredibly accurate. A handful of flour tossed on the hearth told one story. A damp straw told another. Some bakers used their arms as thermometers, sliding them briefly into the mouth of the oven to consult the oracle of discomfort. Meanwhile, the dough sat under cloths thin enough to hint and thick enough to protect, swelling with carbon dioxide and optimism. This is the quiet part that makes people drowsy. Not much appears to happen, and then suddenly everything has happened. It would be a mistake to imagine that baking ended at bread. It also produced paperwork. The assize said every town must keep an eye on its loaves the way a cat keeps an eye on a moving patch of sun. Officials, onagers, bread viewers, clerks with hats that made sense to someone carried scales. Not delicate scales, but sturdy devices that understood work. They weighed sample loaves according to a schedule that looked suspiciously like the town's gossip timetable. If wheat was 8 shillings the quarter, the standard penny loaf weighed thus. If wheat sulked and cost more, the weight sighed and became less. thick tables recorded it all. Columns of numbers like barley stalks standing in rows, punctuated by notes such as rain. A baker could read the law the way a sailor reads weather. Not always cheerful, but generally persuasive, households, for their part, did not care to memorize the tables. They simply learned that a loaf had moods. On lean years, it was a little smaller, like a coat after the laundry becomes philosophical about shrinkage. On generous years, the loaf remembered its confidence. Bread changed weight as seasons changed daylight, and no one panicked, which might be the most civilized custom of all. Microfacts, the kind that keep a restless brain occupied, proliferated. A bushel had to be struck, leveled off with a straight stick so no one was cheated by the amount in the middle. A peck was a quarter of a bushel, an amiable quantity, and the charmingly named 12 good men and true might be summoned to judge whether the town's measures were honest, which is a long way of saying someone checked the yardstick with another yardstick. Loaves themselves displayed a kind of civic pride. Many bore bakers' marks, little stamps or cuts pressed into the top before baking, so that if a loaf failed an inspection, it could be matched back to its maker with the calm certainty of a lost glove finding its coat. These marks were not exactly logos and not exactly signatures, but an amiable compromise, a cross, a ladder, a set of wavy lines that looked like a shorthand for steam. The marks accompanied the loaves into hearths, markets, and evidence bags, a multitasking that would impress any modern project manager. If you look at a surviving photograph of a marked loaf, it usually resembles a small piece of architecture that decided to be edible at the last moment. Penalties existed, although they did not disturb anyone's sleep. The tumbril and awkward cart might parade a naughty baker through the streets. A fine might part a baker from a few coins or a portion of pride. In folk tales, a dishonest loaf could be weighed against a Bible, which feels very medieval and very heavy at the same time. Most often, though, correction was quiet. Officials confiscated underweight bread and handed it to the poor, a redistribution scheme with excellent optics that required no complicated graphics. Citizens appreciated the idea that the law could turn a mistake into lunch. It was, in its own way, restorative justice with crumbs. Breaking the day into bread-sized moments gave towns a useful rhythm. Bakers woke when other people were still negotiating with their pillows. They needed in time to a clock that had no second hand. The clock existed more in elbows than in iron. Market women sang lists of loaves as if music could balance. A basket, manchets for the fancy, cobs for the sensible, trencher bread for taverns where thick slices served as both plate and dinner. A 2-for-1 the dishwasher might envy. A boy with good legs ran deliveries to people who misunderstood the term early. Bells marked hours, but noses marked readiness. The smell of crust proved more punctual than any chime. The world is full of clocks. Bakers preferred the one that insists on being eaten because the assize set the price and let the weight float. Money worried less and bread worried more, a trade-off many were happy to accept. When the quarter of wheat rose steeply, the same coin bought a smaller loaf, a practical lesson in economics you could hold. Bakers kept small stones and bits of metal as test weights for their scales, smoothed, labeled, quietly competent. They kept notebooks that were not literature but were accurate, and therefore, in a different way, beautiful. Page after page listed quantities in Latin that had gone to school and English that had not. Rubbing shoulders like neighbors waiting for a ferry, dough had personalities, which bakers described as if gossiping about acquaintances. This one was lively because the barm had been vigorous. That one needed patience and a blanket. Summer dough acted like a confident guest. Winter dough took persuading. Some bakers scalded a portion of flour in hot water, producing a paste that made the loaf tender, a trick that continued quietly into modern recipes under names that sound like nicknames. The crust took color in degrees the way dawn takes light, first pale, then hopeful, then toasted. Someone would tap the bottom and listen for the hollow note that indicates a job done. If you've ever knocked on a loaf and heard that polite drum, you've held a small concert from the 13th century. There were many kinds of bread, all of them proof that the law could make rules without insisting on uniformity. A fine white manchet sat on high tables like a guest who never stains a sleeve. Muslin mixed grain visited busier households and agreed to be cut generously. Rye kept northern towns sturdy through damp months. In coastal places, loaves were salted with the conversation of the sea. Inland, they kept the accents of fields. On fast days, the loaf performed acrobatics, turning thin to accompany fish, turning thick to become the fish's plate. The miracle was not that bread fed people, but that it fed them with interest, texture, smell. The cheerful sound of a crust that shatters ale shared the assize's attention, because even bread likes company. Alehouses brewed something brown and honest, and the law told them not to dilute honesty beyond recognition. Tons, firkins, kilderkins, a set of containers so satisfyingly named you can hear the wood. Ale was measured, tasted, and occasionally sighed at. The same inspectors who weighed loaves took polite sips, a job that appears glamorous until you realize most samples arrived at breakfast, and often from mugs that had just told a long story to someone else. If a brew proved feeble, the price adjusted. If it proved splendid, everyone nodded and pretended not to keep returning to that end of the street. The assize was, at heart, a municipal lullaby. It reassured the nervous town that someone, somewhere, knew how big a loaf should be. It was the opposite of excitement, which is why it lasted so long. The role of regulations grew like ivy on public walls phrases such as henceforth, and under pain of repeating with the soothing predictability of rain on thatch. You can almost hear the clerk's quill. Scratch, pause, scratch. The sand sprinkled to dry the ink. The scroll rolled up with the small satisfaction of a straight line that behaves. People woke, ate, worked, and slept inside a rule that made bread boring in the most comforting way. Not all towns followed the same recipe for order. In Italy, bakers cooperated through guilds that balanced civic pride with the private knowledge of exactly how damp a morning felt. French edicts prized good flour with the seriousness they reserved for good rhetoric. In parts of Germany, bread festivals turned practicality into ceremony, holding up enormous loaves like trophies for the human appetite, which they were. Yet the family resemblance persisted. Weights, measures, marks, and the suspicion that a fair loaf helps keep peace better than a dozen speeches. We standardize phones now with equal passion. Neither the loaf nor the phone thanks us, but both behave. Bread also had a life after first intention. Yesterday's loaf, no longer permitted to be proud, became a trencher, a thick plate that soaked up meat juices and opinions. When the meal ended, trenchers traveled to the poor, who appreciated any plate that was also supper. Stale bread became pottage thickener, pudding skeleton, and proof that thrift is just creativity wearing an apron. Bakers took returns without fuss, because the town would remember their kindness the next time the oven door needed repair or the barn pot sulked. In the ledgers, these small courtesies were recorded briefly and warmly, like friendly weather. Sometimes the law interfered with holidays, which is exactly the sort of gentle scandal that keeps a town awake for 2 extra minutes. On feast days, special loaves, braided, spiced, elaborately complacent, appeared in windows. Inspectors looked the other way, busying themselves with ordinary bread as if special bread were none of their concern, which of course it was. Bakers preened a little. Children carried home loaves that were almost decorations, proving that food occasionally likes to dress up and has no shame about it. When grain harvests failed, the assize revealed its anxious side. The weights announced by the clerk felt like austerity dressed in arithmetic. Bakers stretched dough with peas or beans, substitutes that behaved well but spoke with an accent. The town tightened its belt and its sentences. Yet even then, the ritual continued. Weigh, stamp, bake, sell, give. The law tried to make scarcity predictable, a trick as old as taxation and as new as a bus timetable. The idea was not to avoid hardship. It was to count it, measure it, and make it explain itself. Bread obliged by getting smaller in perfectly legal ways. Eventually, the world reconsidered how to buy food. Markets widened. Coins multiplied. The assize wobbled, then quietly retired to old parchments that smell like dry leaves and patience. Bakers' marks shifted from practical signatures to pretty decorations that had forgotten why they were invented. Scales gave way to guesses again, and then to labeled prices and wrapped slices. Yet if you watch a baker knead dough at 5 in the morning, you can still see the law's shadow stretching across the bench. It is there in the habit of checking weight without needing to. It is there in the knowledge that a loaf is not only a loaf, but a promise to be the size it is supposed to be. The best part, the part that makes the eyelids heavier than any statute, is how ordinary everything was. Flour dust floating in a sunbeam like the town's smallest snow. The little jolt when a loaf slides from peels to hearth, a sound that could be spelled PFF. The way a cooling crust ticks to itself, contracting like a thoughtful kettle. The steady shuffle of feet that have walked the same path from bench to oven. So many times the floorboards would file a map if they could. Nearby, a clerk sits with a pen. He holds a fraction too tightly and updates the table. His numbers as neat as fence posts. 8 shillings, 7, 6. He does not hurry. Bread, unlike excitement, always returns tomorrow dots of the assize of bread and ale, with its careful columns and its citizen scales, is not really a story about control. It is a story about people who chose to make a public agreement that breakfast would not surprise anyone too much. It is a memory of towns that decided fairness could be served in slices. A loaf is lifted, a mark is pressed, a weight is read, and the oven breathes out again. You could listen to this process for quite a long time. You could imagine the crumbs on a table that has learned the contours of elbows. And you could let the numbers soften into the background, like the hum of a millstone that has nothing to prove and all morning to prove it. You might not expect a river to keep track of birthdays that the Nile did in its way, with patient floods that rose each year like a midwife lifting a curtain. In ancient Egypt, birth was not a beginning so much as a continuation of the world's daily habit of being born again. The sun sailed up, the fields greened, and a child arrived as if ushered by the same crew that rode dawn across the sky. If you're still awake when the hippo goddess starts making house calls, you can subscribe or simply let the oars creak you to sleep. People spoke softly of Haika, the practical magic that made things work, the way a knot holds because you believe it will. They called on Taret, large and motherly, shaped like a hippopotamus standing on her back legs, with a crocodile's tail that seemed to say, "I have seen the river." Trust me, her friend Bess, squat and cheerful, stuck his tongue out at misfortune and wore a feathered headdress like a party that refused to end. In little houses brushed with desert dust, amulets lay in bowls near the doorway, faience hippopotami the color of a shallow pool, ivory wands carved with lions and serpents and griffins that looked like the edges of dreams, and the looped jet knot of Isis, a red ribbon of protection that knew exactly how to hold. These were not decorations so much as collaborators. A woman in labor touched the amulets the way a pilot touches instruments for comfort, and because the habit itself has power. Priests might murmur to Meskenet, goddess of birth, and also of the little clay bricks a woman squatted upon, and the name curled through the room like incense from a brazier. Stories joined in, because Egyptians collected myths the way careful people collect receipts. Adam formed himself from silence, Coombe spun children from clay on a potter's wheel. Hathor smiled in sycamore shade and made milk a holy substance. If the 7 Hathors visited, as stories said they sometimes did, they were invited to speak kindly about the baby's future, perhaps to downgrade any dramatic fate to something more like a long, uneventful contentment. Someone sprinkled natron, the polite salt of purification, and someone else hung a strand of beads over the doorway, turquoise and shell, making the threshold look like it had decided to celebrate. And always there was water, the river, in bowls, cool and sensible, ready to rinse hands, soothe foreheads, and remind everyone that life here was a patient conversation between mud and light. The room of birth was a small theater that preferred practical effects. Neighbors arrived with the bris, courtesy of people who know exactly where the baskets live. A midwife, one of the SW&W if she had training, or simply the experienced aunt who had seen more labors than anyone could count checked linen, oil, and the roundness of time. She would have the hands of a person who spends her life making things comfortable, palms smelling faintly of sesame and frankincense, fingers that could turn worry into breath. The birthing stool waited like a low, 3-legged throne, its opening cut so the child would meet the world without acquiring splinters, its handles polished by generations of grateful squeezes. Some families had a pair of bricks instead, wrapped in woven matting and set at a pleasing angle, a geometry workshop for the goddess Mescanet to inspect. Outside, someone fanned embers to warm a pot. Inside, a second midwife made a curtain from reed mats, so modesty could keep working while the body did as it pleased. A pot of beer sat ready, not the noisy kind, but the thick, nourishing beer that behaved like bread with plans, sometimes sweetened with dates, sometimes medicinal with the suggestion of herbs. A strip of linen, long as a story, was torn into sashes so the laboring woman could pull against her own strength. A third helper dabbed oil on temples, then feet, because comfort travels upward. The rhythm of labor found companions. The click of clappers used by dancers in festivals, here tapped softly to set breathing. The whisper of charms written on fresh ostraca, the ink washed into water and sipped, a practical method of swallowing reassurance. The tiny brass rattle of a base amulet shaken in just the way that makes a joke of fear. When a contraction eased, the woman walked courtyards or good for this, or leaned forward, hugging a sycamore beam as if the tree goddess herself were lending a shoulder. When it returned, she squatted, and the midwives counted like farmers counting geese. 1, 2, you're doing well, 3, that's good. With the steady patience of people who have watched the Nile enough to know that everything moving slowly is, in fact, moving. If labor lingered, they brewed an infusion fennel for comfort, caraway for wind, a pinch of cumin because grandmothers trusted, and they blessed the pot with a breath that smelled faintly of honey. On a wall niche, a small lamp burned, complaining in its friendly way, and cast the sort of light that makes any face kinder. Pain visited as it always does, wearing a robe with too many folds, and the household met it with inventory and ritual. Remedies hid in papyri with practical titles and the tone of old ants. The Cahun papyrus might suggest a bandage soaked, and milk and herbs laid low across the belly, a cool logic against hot pain. The Ebers papyrus recommended honey to clean and soothe, a choice that modern doctors nod at, which is one of history's most satisfying parlor tricks. Fumigation wandered through like a helpful gossamer in the brazier, juniper crackling pleasantly, a careful whiff of resin that made the room smell like a small temple that had decided to moonlight. There were spells that behaved like essays and encouragement. Listen open, the midwife sang, touching the jet knot and then untying an actual knot nearby because sympathetic magic appreciates theatrics. An ivory wand traced a protective circle on the floor, not because lines have power though. Sometimes they do, but because drawing them turns fear into an activity. If the child hesitated, babies are notorious for arriving exactly on their own schedule. The midwives tried different postures, coaxing the body like a door that needs a gentler hinge. If nothing answered, prayer took a chair. Isis was reminded of the time she saved Horus, of the time she made boats out of marshes and found solutions in reeds. And if danger sharpened, which it sometimes did, they did not panic. They measured. The worm blade was ready for a cut if a cut could save. The compress waited to stop a flood if a flood wanted to practice the Nile indoors. Mortality hovered in the doorway without being invited to sit. Later inscriptions in tombs speak, in their dry way, of mothers and infants lost, and it is important to keep our voice low here. What the text did not say is equally telling. The quiet stubbornness of hands that did everything they could. The gentle ways a community pretended the world would certainly behave because pretending sometimes persuades it. Meanwhile, tiny microfacts kept minds busy and useful. Egyptians tested for pregnancy with barley and emmer, watering grains with a woman's urine to watch for sprouting, a home experiment that modern science, with some surprise, admitted was more than folklore. Others gently sniffed onions to see if the scent rose through the body, an olfactory geometry lesson with mixed reviews. Not all remedies aged well, but many were simply care given shape warm cloths. Clean water, rest and care is stubbornly modern. When the child finally slipped into the world like a seal into river light, the room changed its grammar from imperative to exclamation. Someone caught the small body in linen, not crisp linen, but the soft kind that has given up ambition. The first cry arrived, and all the protective gods nodded, because a good complaint is a sign of strength in someone seconds old. A sliver of umbilical cord was tied with a neatness that would have pleased any scribe. A dab of oil glossed the hair, which always surprises people by existing, and the baby's mouth tasted a drop of honey, sweet negotiating with a new appetite. The mother drank water scented lightly with mint or fenugreek, and swallowed with the same swallow the knowledge that she had moved a horizon. In some households, the infant touched Nile water, a miniature baptism that smelled faintly of silt and papyrus. In others, a priest wrote protective words on a fresh shard of pottery, rinsed them away, and told the parents to keep the bowl for porridge, as if the child could eat safety one spoon at a time. Names were discussed in the proper Egyptian manner, slowly with anecdotes, and with the sugar of flattery for any living relatives who might be echoed. The 7 Hathors were asked politely to approve. Perhaps a festival singer stopped by, shaking a little sistrum, the metallic whisper making the air sound friendly. A wet nurse might be hired if the mother needed rest or rank required it. She knew songs about cows and moonlight, and had the unflappable calm of someone who reads infants like weather. The household tidied the room as if erasing a spell, and tucked away the amulets, now slightly smug. Daily life resumed with delicate adjustments. A cradle, more a basket than a bed, was set near a draft that wasn't a draft. A cat inspected it and pretended not to approve. Someone hung a string of blue beads to guard against the eye that envies. Toys appeared by the natural law that governs all toy appearances. A small faience hippopotamus that rolled, a wooden crocodile that did not, a rattle made from a dried gourd that held pebbles and secrets. Temple inscriptions would one day mention this child in a line as brief as a breath, son of, daughter of, and that would be enough. In time, tiny footprints decorated courtyards. In time, first teeth announced themselves with the fussiness of ambassadors and were soothed with rings of date palm fiber and a smear of cooling paste. The family told the same stories every evening until the stories learned the furniture. And when the child slept, the house listened to a silence so complete the desert itself seemed to lean closer. From these small cries, the voices of pharaohs and field workers alike once rose, carried by the river's endless patience and by hands that believed in help. If you are still awake, You can listen for water moving through reeds, and for the thin hiss of a lamp pretending to be a star, and for the rustle of linen promising quietly that morning will come, and with it, another unremarkable miracle. You might not expect a river to keep track of birthdays, but the Nile did, in its unhurried way, by arriving every year with a gift of silt and the extremely polite reminder that life likes to repeat itself. In ancient Egypt, birth was not a sudden event so much as a continuation of good habits. The sun rose, bread baked, cattle chewed, babies arrived. If you're still awake by the time we get to the barley sprouting pregnancy test, you're welcome to subscribe or to simply let your eyes do what the Nile does and drift. People here called everyday effectiveness Heke useful magic, the kind that made a knot hold and a door close and a prayer feel like a tool. When a household sensed a child on the way, it reached for allies who were regulars. Tauret, the immensely capable hippopotamus goddess who stood upright as if chairs were for mortals. And Bes, the short, leonine guardian who specialized in scaring bad dreams so thoroughly that they forgot what they were doing. Their faces peered from amulets the color of shallow water, faience blue with hairline crazing that looked like maps. A looped red jet knot of Isis hung near a doorway, because protection likes thresholds, and a little wand carved of ivory lions, snakes, fantastical spirits walking nose to tail weighted on a shelf. These things did not sit quietly. They supervised dot stories were part of the furniture. Tum shaped children on his potter's wheel, turning damp clay into knees and eyelids with the concentration of a craftsman who knows every trick his hands will try. Hathor shaded laboring women like a sycamore tree that had decided, out of kindness, to offer milk. Mescanet, lady of the birth bricks, owned the moment the child breathed. She also owned the bricks themselves, which made her doubly practical. The air had the light beeswax smell of a lamp and the faint, chalky coolness of natron sprinkled for cleansing. Someone placed a bowl of Nile water near the bed, not as symbolism, though it was happy to serve, but because water remembers every job it has ever done. A priest might murmur a formula just loud enough for the letters to feel useful. The household counted linens and counted comforts. There was oil for aching backs and a little pouch of malachite powder that normally lived with eye paint, but now served as an antiseptic pinch for tiny scrapes, because ancient households loved when one jar solved two problems. And there was bread beer, the thick, nourishing sort that behaves more like breakfast than celebration, sometimes flavored with dates or honey that made it smell like polite conversation. Everything waited the way markets wait before dawn, ready but not surprised, when labor began. It sounded like advice learned long ago and now remembered. Brave here, lean there. Do not negotiate with a contraction because it has already signed the contract. Midwives slipped into the house the way competent people do, with little fuss and the calm hands of those who have seen every variation arrive on time. We do not know their exact titles the way we know the titles of scribes, but the word swan wandered in from medicine, and experience did most of the talking. The birthing stool low, with a crescent cut out, had been polished by decades of borrowed strength. Sometimes it was replaced by two birth bricks wrapped in reed matting, set at a patient angle. This geometry pleased Mescanet and Knees alike. A helper hung reed mats to make a small room inside the room, a nest within a nest, because even brave people like privacy when they are doing heroic, mammalian things. Another helper mixed a bowl of sesame oil and water, a shine that felt like comfort on temples and belly. The woman in labor held a long linen sash pulling against her own body as a deeply Egyptian ID, and the sash allowed work to become a movement she controlled. The midwife's voice kept a slow beat, and through the nose, out through the mouth, like counting crocodiles who are perfectly well behaved. During pauses, the small theatrics of Heka performed themselves. Someone untied a simple knot, asking the body to copy the gesture. Someone shook a tiny bass rattle, the sound like grain pouring into a jar. On a potsherd scavenged from yesterday's broken jug because thrift enjoys being sacred short lines of ink formed a charm. The ink was then rinsed into water and sipped, the practical alchemy of turning words into drink, which is the sort of medicine even modern minds appreciate on a Wednesday. Herbs joined the conversation without insisting they were the main topic. Cumin for digestion, caraway for comfort, fennel because grandmothers everywhere approve of it. The room smelled gently of frankincense, not a temple cloud, just enough to persuade the air to sit up straight. A cat drifted through with the attitude of a veteran nurse who has seen it all and prefers a warm basket. When pain grew sharp, the midwife was an expert in stalling tactics, the tiny adjustments that make an hour behave. She might lift a knee, shift a foot, slide a cushion, and say, "there," in that satisfied tone that suggests a lever has been found. The wider landscape never stopped attending. Outside, the river moved as if no one had asked it to, and geese talked about their complicated personal lives. Inside, the mathematics of the human body negotiated. If the body liked to be upright, the stool was pleased. If it needed to walk, the courtyard was ready, a lap around the fig tree, measuring time as pleasantly as a long sentence. There were cooling cloths that smelled faintly of mint and warming bricks wrapped in linen, because contrasts have always been persuasive. The old papyri whispered in the background, whether or not anyone present had read them. The Cahun papyrus kept lists for gynecological matters with the brisk voice of an office manager. The Ebers papyrus, encyclopedic and unbothered, offered honey and resins and the sort of recipes that begin to make a remedy that is good. Honey's antibacterial stubbornness regularly impressed the future. And then there was the barley test that households made for themselves. Soak barley and emmer in a jar each day and see if anything sprouts. If the grains wake, you probably will greet a baby in due time. Modern lab coats, centuries later, had to admit that the test worked often enough to be remembered, which is a delightful footnote to carry around like a small candy in a pocket. Sometimes, as the sun hiked a little higher, the labor settled into the kind of rhythm that makes time edible. The midwife counted without numbers, just the gentle yes and again that acknowledges persistence as a craft. If a contraction behaved like a stubborn door, she asked the mother to face the wall and sway, and the door usually remembered its manners. The family flowed around the edges. A grandmother hummed something about cows and moonlight. A cousin washed linen with almost religious attention to corners. A neighbor arrived with extra bread as if calories were talismans, which, in a way, they were. The soundscape remained low. Oil lamp whisper, feathery broom swish, the quiet punctuation of clay cups set down without chipping. Every now and then a visiting aunt offered an anecdote about a previous birth that involved a goat and the moon and ended well. The point of such anecdotes was not information but geometry, drawing a larger circle in which the present moment could fit comfortably. But sometimes birth resisted suggestion. When it did, ritual and practicality tightened their laces. Ivory magic knives traced protective arcs. A priestess untied every knot in the room, including her hair, because symbolism, when done properly, turns into ergonomics. If the child was slow to breathe, a pinch of natron kissed tiny lips, more habit than science, but tender all the same. If bleeding ran like a mischievous canal, compresses learned to be heavy and astringent potions remembered their tasks. Quietly, danger could be real. Tomb stele and formal letters do not dwell on those hours, but archaeology is a patient reader of absence. Mortality stood like a shadow at the door, and the household did what humans have always done in the shadow: measured, pressed, whispered, waited. There were no heroics carved in high relief, only the dull, excellent heroism of not giving up. And often, overwhelmingly often, the body did its old ancestral work, and everyone remembered how to exhale. The transition from labor to newness happened the way Nile dawn happens, a thin change in the color of air, and then everything is different. The child slid into hands that were already warm. Midwives wrapped the small bundle in linen that had earned its softness through repeated affection. A first cry arrived like a polite announcement that lungs had checked in. The cord was tied and cut with the same respect given to a good rope, because ropes and lives both deserve integrity. Oil brightened the baby's hair, which surprised everyone by having an opinion. Honey touched the tongue, not as dessert, but as negotiation with appetite. If the household was particularly old-fashioned, a drop of wine or beer moistened gums with the ceremonial confidence of people who trust yeast. The mother drank water that smelled lightly of fenugreek, and a finger traced the jet knot on her wrist. Somewhere, a scribe's reed pen would one day write this child's name next to born of, a small miracle baked into grammar. Naming itself moved slowly, as all important simple tasks do. The 7 Hathors were gently consulted, whether in a formal chapel or in the half-sacred space near an oven where prayers often congregate. Names held wishes: Nephro, beauty; Amenos, born of Amen, an echo of a grandmother's syllables, so she would laugh and say she felt honored and then start bringing more dates. A wet nurse might be hired, a career that involved both status and stamina. She arrived with competence and lullabies that had survived dozens of toddlers. She knew the exact temperature of shade. She also knew gossip from the temple courtyards and delivered it on a time delay between naps. The household made minor renovations around tiny lungs. A cradle was woven out of palm fibers that made a dry, participatory music. Blue beads were strung to distract the jealous glance of the world. A little faience hippopotamus tarred again, moonlighting as a toy watched from the floor, with the face of a goddess pretending to be a pet. First rituals threaded themselves through the next days like friendly errands. The infant's hair might be scented with a touch of kiffy, the famous mixture of wine, raisins, myrrh, and the patient attention of whoever has to stir. A Hathord musician, passing by on some other job, rattled a sistrum softly, the metal discs clinking like brushed silver. If there was a shrine nearby, the family visited and left figs in a loaf whose top had cracked as attractively as dry earth. A fragment of ostrich shell or a carved shell pendant joined the amulet string, because protection enjoys layering. The midwife returned to check stitches that weren't stitches but neat bands of linen, and to admire the baby the way experts admire a well-made basket with respect for craft. Pets auditioned for the role of guardian. Dogs practiced looking solemn. Cats perfected a vigilant indifference that fooled no one. The courtyard learned the new schedule of sun, shade, and swaddling. Meanwhile, administrative Egypt, which always had a tablet somewhere, took note in its casual way. In temple lists and private letters, children appeared like commas. To my brother, may you live, the boy is well. And the papyrus moved on to barley rations. Yet in houses, the tiniest archaeology accumulated handprints in wine-red paint on a wall, a chalk mark at shoulder height every festival month, a clay rattle forgotten under a niche. Mothers nursed in doorways with the same posture used by women depicted in tomb scenes centuries apart, as if the body had its own memory independent of time. Fathers performed the exact complicated dance of pretending not to worry while hovering. Grandmothers kept a small, secret ledger of first smiles, which they updated with stern accuracy. The desert outside hummed its dry song. The river lifted and fell. The house learned the ordinary miracles of weighing nothing and also everything. How many breaths between cries? How many heartbeats for a nap? How much silence until the lamp needs a little more oil? You could read this quiet as you'd read a stele. The tools of birth became the tools of days. The birthing stool faded back into a bench. The ivory wand returned to the shelf where keys and shells enjoy retirement. The jet knot, scuffed and powerful, kept the doorway busy with protection. The same barley that once ran a test went back to being grain bread for mornings, beer for afternoons, offerings for deities who liked both. On festival nights, the baby slept while drums far away untied the knots in strangers' feet. On market mornings, the baby slept again while baskets argued gently about onions. The house never forgot that life had been risky. It simply became, as houses do, affectionate with routine. Eventually, there would be toys buried in the courtyard, a chipped bowl kept for sentimental reasons, a scratched line on the lintel at the height of a 7th birthday. Eventually, the child would toddle into the world of scribes or fields or boats under a sun that refused to be surprised. If you are still with me, if the lamp burns like a patient star at your shoulder, you might hear what the Nile hears most nights. Soft voices counting ordinary blessings, the low laughter of women relieved after worry, the feathered hush of a goddess waddling back to the river with good news. Somewhere, a cradle creaks on its rope. Somewhere, a scribe wipes his reed pen and notes a name that will not enter history, which is another way of entering it perfectly. And the river keeps time like a very old midwife who has given up announcing the hour because everyone can feel it. Nothing concludes exactly. Someone adds oil to the lamp. Someone tightens a knot. A baby sighs the smallest possible amen, and the night unrolls like linen, ready for more careful folds. You might not expect a birth plan to be carved into everyday objects, but in ancient Egypt it sits there calmly on the things people touched all the time. A hippo goddess on a bead, a lion dwarf on a cosmetic jar, a neat line of hieratic ink on a broken potsherd that someone once used as a shopping list and later turned into a charm. The idea was steady and not in a hurry. Birth was simply the universe repeating itself politely, the way the Nile repeats flood and hush and flood again. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe, or you can do what the river does and wander off into the delta of sleep. No pressure. The Egyptians used a word, heka, which we translate as magic, but it behaved more like household engineering. It turned knots into rituals, bandages into spells, smoke into medicine. The beginning of life was not a surprise party. It was logistics with incense. When families suspected a child was on the way, the house adjusted its furniture of ideas. Torah, the pregnant hippopotamus who stood upright as if she had business hours, watched from the shelf with a crocodile on her back and a knowing smile. Base, a short and shaggy guardian with a posture that said, "I've seen things," glared from the handle of a cosmetic spoon. Amulets were small but very busy. Blue faience glinted like shallow water. Carnelian warmed like sunset. The jet knot of Isis lay cool against the wrist, as comfortable as a favorite bracelet. No one thought of these as decorations. They were more like hard-working colleagues who never took holidays. A doorway might receive a dab of red ochre because thresholds like to be reminded what side they're on. If the household had a little clay hippo or an ivory wand carved with prowling creatures, it was less a superstition than a toolkit. Pregnancy itself had tests that were somehow both whimsical and practical. One involved barley and emmer. You moistened grains with the woman's urine and set them to sprout. If the barley woke first, people said, boy. If the emmer, girl. If nothing sprouted at all, perhaps wait to celebrate. Centuries later, laboratory people in white coats tried this for fun and found that urine rich in certain hormones really can speed up seeds. The ancient instructions never once used the words biochemical indicator. They simply trusted plants to deliver office memos. Meanwhile, the body asked for comforts the house already knew how to provide. There was bread beer that behaved like breakfast. There was oil that smelled very lightly of marjoram, because marjoram gives the impression it knows what it's doing. There were chairs arranged near breezes, quilts that had known grandmothers, and the secular miracle of a cool clay jar sweating in the shade. Belief slid into storytelling as easily as linen slides over skin. Tin shaped the unborn on his potter's wheel, turning damp clay into ankles and tiny ears with the deliberate attention of a man who sharpens his own tools. Hathor shaded the mother like a sycamore who had chosen to be generous that day. Mescanet, mistress of the birth bricks, presided over the very moment a child inhaled, and since she also owned the bricks themselves, she made sure the equipment never arrived late. People did not argue theology about this. They set a little tray of figs and bread near a household niche and carried on. A priest might pass by to murmur a few words. A relative would mutter a few more, because in Egypt words were things, and it never hurt to have extra. When the hours of labor arrived, they did not arrive alone. Midwives stepped in with the measured confidence of people who had already learned the names of 100 kinds of pain and also how to ignore most of them politely. Titles in our sources are vague. We borrow soignois from general medical texts, but the competence is not. A midwife knew where to place her hands and when to take them away. She brought a birthing stool that remembered other mornings. It was low, with a crescent cut out, and the wood had been burnished by a century of borrowed strength. Sometimes bricks wrapped in reed mats took the place of a stool. The mother leaned on a long linen sash, pulling against the weight of her own body. It is a very Egyptian solution, turning a piece of cloth into physics. Privacy screens made from mats carved a temporary room inside the room, because even brave people like to be brave quietly. The air learned to be useful. Bowls of water stood ready, slightly cool, with a sweetness that comes when clay jars breathe. A helper warmed bricks and wrapped them in linen. Another mixed sesame oil and a little beer, a shine meant for temples and lower backs. Someone tied their hair loosely because Egyptians preferred not to keep knots around a laboring woman. Symbolism, when properly respected, often becomes ergonomics. When a contraction insisted on being dramatic, the midwife adjusted the angle of a foot and said, "There," with such authority that even the pain felt it should apologize. Between surges, household theatrics performed themselves. A small rattle shaped like bee sang its grainy whisper. An Astrakhan yesterday's broken jug, washed and repurposed, received a brief incantation in ink. Then the ink was rinsed into water and sipped, turning handwriting into potion. There were herbs with rhizomes, cumin and caraway for the gut, fennel to reassure appetite, a quiet pinch of mandrake or poppy in theory, though in practice, Egypt liked remedies that could be grown or bought along the street. Heat measured itself on the skin. Time measured itself in the quiet clicks of pottery set down without chipping. The house practice being calm. Grandmothers hummed a little tune that would have annoyed any god who disliked cows, but fortunately Hathor is fond of cows. A cousin kept the lamp trimmed to the point where flame becomes behavior. A family cat wandered through with the blaze gait of a nurse on break, giving the birthing stool a professional nod. If you listen for drama, you will not find it here. Even pain seemed to understand that it was taking part in a very old craft, and therefore should keep its elbows to itself. When labor lengthened, spells stretched too. The ivory magic knife, all lions and serpents in a parade, traced protective arcs that were more choreography than weapon. Names of deities: Isis, who knows sorrow and shortcuts, Nephthys, who remembers doors passed mouth to mouth like bread. The midwife knew tricks that had nothing to do with gods and everything to do with leverage. A sway against the wall, a change of angle, the persuasive firmness of hands on a shoulder. If the child came slowly and the room held its breath, a little natron might touch a lip, because natron was a very Egyptian way to say, "Please begin." If bleeding misbehaved, Compresses learned to be heavy, and resinous mixtures tried to convince vessels to be modest. The ancient papyri do not narrate heroics. They mention honey often, which is an excellent kind of humility to practice in medicine. When all went as it usually did, there came the precise wet sound of newness, and then a cry that ranked itself not as drama but as proof. Hands that had been warmed for hours received a slippery citizen. The cord was tied and cut with the same respect given to a good rope. The baby met oil on the fontanelle and a quick kiss of honey on the tongue, because appetite likes formal invitations. Someone laughed in the small way people laugh when something larger than laughter has just occurred. A bowl appeared with water that looked ordinary and was, which is exactly why it mattered. The cosmos, as fond of logistics, the first hours after birth were a round of tiny negotiations. The mother drank gently sweetened water and rested with the determined politeness of a person obeying gravity. The baby learned the shape of an arm and the temperature of breath. A wet nurse might arrive with a reputation and a lullaby that had tamed many evenings. Her profession was ancient and bureaucratically tidy. Documents from workmen's villages list her rations in the same column as everybody else's onions. She could spot a draft across a room with her eyes closed and close it with a shawl. The household tried names on the air the way one tries sandals. The 7 Hathors, consulted whether formally at a shrine or informally in a whisper, were thought to take an interest in the story and sometimes to hint at a profession, although the hints read very much like the advice of experienced aunts. Be kind to cattle. Avoid large boats unless you are certain. An inscription might come later. For the moment, a nickname held the world together perfectly well. Objects changed jobs without complaint. The birthing stool became again a small bench for shelling beans. The ivory wand went back to being that thing on the top shelf that you notice after dusting. Amulets remained on duty. The blue beads of faience cooled the eye the way shade cools the shoulder. A small protective string tied from wrist to shoulder in a figure 8 said, with excellent grammar, "Please do not." The doorway kept its dot of red. A cradle woven from palm fibers creaked gently like a conversation with a basket. Pets auditioned for sentry, dogs offered sincerity. Cats offered vigilance disguised as disinterest. The courtyard learned a new routine of sun and shadow. In the broader city, paperwork pretended to be indifferent. Letters read, "May you live." The boy is well. Then they went back to brick quotas. Yet in houses, the archaeology of small things accumulated. Rattle beads under a mat, a smear of kiffy perfuming a corner, a footprint in drying plaster that will delight some future graduate student. Childhood left its evidence in tomb scenes, where children wear the sidelock of youth and carry birds as if they have already negotiated complex contracts. The sidelock did not make them sacred. It made them identifiable in a crowded relief, like a little arrow saying, "This one." In life, the same children mostly napped and then woke and then napped again. Sometimes, of course, birth was not merciful. The ancient texts sidestep this like people walk around a rock they know too well. Archaeology uncovers small burials tenderly placed and jars of milk left where milk will never be drunk. The tone of Egypt, even then, refused melodrama. It preferred care that could be measured, a linen folded more carefully than usual, a name spoken when nobody else is listening. Priests and midwives did the same thing people do now, what they could. The house, which had learned to be a nest, became also a cloak. Mourning had its days and then folded itself away so that work could proceed. The river kept its appointments, not from coldness, but from having many households to visit. For many families, the first weeks blurred into a calendar of small rites. A sistrum might sound softly, metal discs answering one another like coins in good humor. A goddess's statue received a dot of unguent with a care that could pass inspection by any auditor, divine or domestic. The baby's hair received a touch of oil. The mother's shoulders did as well. Someone tied an ostrich shell pendant to the amulet string because shells look like moons, and everyone enjoys a portable moon. Laundry learned the scent of milk and frankincense, a combination that later archaeologists will politely describe as domestic. The first outing felt like walking through familiar streets with an improved caption. Neighbors delivered gossip folded around dates. Grandfathers demonstrated how to nap in the shade without looking like a person who has fallen asleep on the job. Feeding was, as always, a schedule pretending to be a philosophy. If the child woke hungry at inconvenient times, Egypt had an answer ready. Inconvenience is simply the universe instructing you to sit down. Breck beer in a cup became a parent's acquaintance. The wet nurse knew latitude and longitude of quiet corners. She also knew a song about a cow in a boat that made no sense and performed miracles. Toys were not designed, they were promoted. A faience hippo became a friend. A reed ring became a wheel. A broken pot handle became a horse with good intentions. Somewhere, an older sibling adjusted to the concept of not being the only sun in the sky, a process. That has not changed in 5,000 years. The gods, wise in their way, allowed it to sort itself out. Records quietly confirm what houses loudly knew. In Deir el-Medina, a workman's village on the west bank at Thebes, Ostraka preserved notes about absent days taken for the wife's delivery. It is the bureaucratic voice of compassion dry, exact and correct. Contracts exist for the hiring of wet nurses with clauses that would satisfy any modern human resources department. Medical papyri propose poultices of honey and resin with a confidence that has aged better than many empires. The point of all this paper was not to be impressive. It was to make something fragile feel supported by routine. And then years stack themselves without asking. The child grows into the margins of tomb scenes, chasing birds and carrying flowers with the solemnity of someone who understands gifting as a moral act. The sidelock persists until one day it doesn't. A small scar on a knee becomes a landmark as important as any obelisk. The house adjusts again, quietly, the way boats adjust to new water. Someone in the family, an aunt with sensible sandals, perhaps teaches letters on a potsherd by the doorway, and the first clumsy life, prosperity, health looks like a spell someone forgot to stir. Another someone discovers that dates left within reach will go missing, and the household treats this not as theft, but as a kind of religious observance in honor of appetite. If you have drifted a little while we wandered from goddess to backyard to ledger, that is quite in the spirit of things. Egypt took birth seriously by making it ordinary. It is the kind of seriousness that sharpens a knife and folds a cloth and ties a knot and says an old line, because it worked the last time and will probably work again. In this slow competence, there is something very companionable. Lamps burn low. The Nile chooses, once again, to arrive. A baby breathes with the tiny diligence of all new citizens. Somewhere a midwife, home at last, sets a bowl on a shelf with the thoughtful clink of a person who is already thinking about tomorrow's work. And the house sleeps with the attentive quiet of a cat pretending to dream. And Bess pretends not to be pleased with himself. And Taret leans back from her shelf. A goddess who has done a long shift and will return when called. There's no final flourish here. The night unspools like linen from a careful hand. The cool stars learn the names, or forget them, or do both. The cradle creaks once. The river speaks in its low, practical voice. And breath by breath, the old world becomes new again without feeling the need to announce it.